Hi, welcome to part 3 on our exploration of Pacific art. In this segment, we're going to be looking at ancestor portraits. This was a work I gave you to do your journal response on, so we will talk about that and use that for an activity. We all know portraits can be made of an ancestor, but can a portrait be an ancestor? In Te Ao Maori, in the Maori world, they can't. They can. Paintings like this one and even photographs do two important things. They record likeness and bring ancestral presence into the world of the living. In other words, this portrait is not merely a representation of Tamati Wakini. It can be an embodiment of him. Portraits and other Tananga Tuku Hu Ihu, and these are, it translates treasures passed down from the ancestors, are treated with great care and reverence. After a person has died, their portrait may be hung on the wall of family homes, and in the Wa Renui, the central building of a community center, to be spoken to, wept over, and cherished by people with genealogical connections to them. Even when portraits like this one, kept in the collection of the Auckland Art Gallery, are absent from their family, the stories woven around them kept them alive and present. Auckland Art Gallery acknowledges these living links through its relationship with descendants of those whose portraits it cares for. The gallery seeks their advice when asking permission to reproduce such portraits. This portrait has been published in the Google Art Project, which is why we can look at it here. Tamati Wakini Maori are the indigenous people of New Zealand. The subject of this portrait, Tamati Wakanini, that's probably how you're supposed to say it, was a Rangatiri, or chief of the Ngati Ha'o people, and Ho Kia Ninga of the Nigapuhi Iwi, or tribe, an important war leader. He was probably born in the 1780s and died in 1871. He lived through a time of rapid change in New Zealand when the first British missionaries and settlers were arriving and changing the Maori world forever. An astute leader and businessman, Nini exemplified the types of changes that were occurring when he converted to the Wesleyan faith and was baptized in 1839, chosen to be named Tamati Waki after Thomas Walker, who was an English merchant patron of the Church Missionary Society. He was revered throughout his life as a man with great mana, or personal efficacy, so Wesleyanism is a Protestant. That's, in case you were wondering what that was. It's spelled Wesleyanism. Is a Protestant domination following the theology of John Wesley. Wesleyanism is associated with the Methodist Church. I was trying to pronounce it like it was some sort of Pacific term, but it's European. Let's look at some detail shots. In this portrait, Nini wears a kahu kiwi, a fine cloth covered in kiwi feathers, and an earring of greenstone, or pau namu. Both of these are prestigious taonga, that's how you say it, or treasures. Again, the treasures passed down from ancestors as well. He is holding a hand weapon known as a tiwatewa, which has feathers adorning its blade, and a finely carved hand grip with an abalone eye. All of these mark him as a man of mana, or personal efficacy, and status, but perhaps the most striking feature of an international for an international audience is his intricate facial tattoo called Moko. Lindar was a Czech artist who arrived in New Zealand in 1873 after a decade of painting professionally in Europe. He had studied at the Academy of Fine Art in Vienna from 1855 to 1861 and learned painting techniques rooted in Renaissance naturalism. When he left the academy, he began to work as a portrait painter and established his own portrait studio in 1864. Just 10 years later, he arrived in New Zealand and quickly became acquainted with a man called Henry Partridge, who became his patron. Partridge commissioned Lindar to paint portraits of well-known Maori, and 3 years later, in 1877, Lindar held an exhibition in Wellington. The exhibition was important because it demonstrated Lindar's abilities, and he was soon being commissioned by Maori chiefs to paint their portraits. Lindara, I'm saying his name wrong, took different approaches to his commissions depending on who was paying. He tended to paint well-known Maori and Maori clothing for European purchasers, but painted unknown Maori in everyday European clothing when commissioned by their families to do so. His paintings are realistic, convincingly three-dimensional, and play beautifully with the contrast between light and shadow, causing his subjects to glow against their dark backgrounds. As his patron, Partridge amassed a large collection of portraits as well as large-scale depictions that reenacted Maori ways of life that were thought to be disappearing. In 1915, Partridge gave his collection of 62 portraits to the Auckland Art Gallery, the largest collection of Lindauer paintings in the world. If you've been paying attention to dates, you will have noticed that Nini died in 1871, but Lindauer didn't arrive in New Zealand until 1873 and didn't paint his portrait until 1890. It is likely that Lindauer based his portrait on a photograph taken by John Crombie, who had been commissioned to produce 12 photographic portraits of Maori chiefs for the London Illustrated News, and you can see that in the image to the left. There are several other photographs of Nini, and in 1934, Charles F. Goldie, another famous portrayer of Maori, painted yet another portrait of him from a photograph. So Nini didn't sit for either of his famous painted portraits, but clearly sat for the photographic portraits in later years of his life. These were becoming more common by 1870 due to developments in the photographic methods that made the whole process easier and cheaper. Many Maori had their portraits taken photographically and produced as carte de visite, roughly the size of a playing card. Some had larger postcard-sized images called cabinet portraits. Lindauer is thought to have used a device called a pitoscope to enlarge and project small photographs such as these so he could paint them. Lindauer didn't make many sketches. He worked straight onto stretched canvas, outlining his subjects in pencil over a white background before applying translucent paints and glazes. Through the thinly painted surface, some of his work you can still see traces of pencil lines that may be evidence of his practice of outlining projected images. But Lindauer wasn't simply copying photographs. In the 1870s, colored photography had yet to be invented. Lindauer was working from black and white images and reimagined them in color, which I think he did beautifully in this portrait. Lindauer moreover sometimes dressed his sitters. So you can see in the photograph he's wearing modern clothing for that time, and so he presented him in more of his ancestral indigenous clothing. So he borrowed garments and adorned them with tananga that were not necessarily theirs. So he kind of looked at these objects. Thus, some of his work contains artistic interventions rather than being entirely documentary, which is something to consider. All right, so we're going to be kind of switch gears. We're going to be talking about probably one of the greatest achievements of the Pacific Islanders is this idea of navigation. The Marshall Islands in eastern Micronesia consist of 34 coral atolls consisting of more than 1,000 islands and islets spreading out across an area of several hundred miles. In order to maintain links between the islands, the Marshall Islanders built seafaring canoes. These vessels were both quick and maneuverable. The islanders developed a reputation for navigation between the islands, not a simple matter since they all are so low, but knowing that none can be seen from more than a few miles away. So in order to navigate, they had to use these navigation charts. So this is a chart. It's a type known as Reb Bilib, which covered either a large section or all of the Marshall Islands. Other types of charts more commonly showed a similar area. This example represents two chain of islands which formed the Marshall Islands. It was collected by Admiral E.H.M. Davis during the cruise of the HMS Royalist from 1890 to 1893. And so I have a few videos that you need to watch that really show the tradition of these, how these navigation charts are made and what they represent. I mean, to navigate the ocean the way these islanders did is really is unbelievable, and probably was very dangerous. This is another type of chart. This is known as a mat tang, specifically made for the purpose of training people selected to be navigators. Such charts depict general information about swell movements around one or more small islands. Trainees were taught by experienced navigators, and it is a dying art. Navigation charts continue to be made, often simpler in form, to be sold as souvenirs. Go back to this chart. This is the one that is featured in your AP College Board list. So these are often referred to as stick charts as well. And they're meant to be schematic diagrams of the prevailing currents and the characteristic wave patterns encountered between islands. Currents are represented by sticks held together by coconut fibers. Attached shells mark islands along the route. The arrangement of sticks around a shell indicate a zone of distinctive waves shaped by the effect of an island deflecting the prevailing wind. Such refracted waves enable a navigator to sense the proximity of land without being able to see it, and to discern the least difficult course for making landfall. Although Wapiti are primarily functional, their combination of clarity, simplicity, and abstraction has an aesthetic impact as well. So they're quite beautiful. All right, so we're going to switch back and look at some sculpture. So this is referred to as a Malangan figure. This figure was made for a Malangan as cycle of rituals of the people of the north coast of New Ireland, an island in Papua New Guinea. Malangan expresses many complex religious and philosophical ideas. They are principally concerned with honoring and dismissing the dead, but they also act as an affirmation of the identity of clan groups and negotiate the transmission of rights to land. Malangan sculptures were made to be used on a single occasion and then destroyed. So it's crazy because it's so intricately worked, and it looks like it took a lot of time to make something like this. These figures are symbolic of many important subjects, including identity, kinship, gender, death, and the spirit world. They often include representations of fish and birds, of unidentifiable species. the opposite of that, identifiable species, alluding both to specific myths and the animal's natural characteristics. For example, at the base of this figure is depicted a rock cod, a species which, as it grows older, changes gender from male to female. The rock cod features an important myth of the founding of the first social group or clan in this area. Thus, the figure also alludes to the identity of that clan group. The figure that we just looked at previously was collected by Hugh Hastings Romilly, who was the Deputy Commissioner for the Western Pacific while he was on tour of New Ireland in 1882 through 83. It was one of a group of carvings made to be displayed at a particular Molongan ritual. It is made of wood, vegetable fiber, pigment, and shell. They were originally standing in a carved canoe, which unfortunately Romilly did not collect. The whole group was presented to the British Museum by the Duke of Bedford in 1884 after Romilly had sent it to him. Here is another set of these figures, and this is one of the images that your AP College Board uses. Molongan masks are commonly used as at funeral rites, which both bid farewell to the dead and celebrate the vibrancy of the living. The masks can represent a number of things: dead ancestors, something known as GES, G-E-S, the spiritual double of an individual. And this theme of duality is something that we'll see in other cultures as well, or the various bush spirits associated with the area. Ownership of a Molongan object is similar to the modern notion of copyright. When a piece is bought, the seller surrenders the right to use that particular Molongan style, the form in which it is made, and even the accompanying rights. This stimulates production as more elaborate variations are made to replace the ones that have been sold. Molongan ceremonies became extremely expensive affairs, taking into account the cost of the accompanying feast. As a result, the funeral rites could take place months after a person had died. In some circumstances, the ceremony would have been held for several people simultaneously. This is one of the Molongan masks that's featured on the AP College Board images. This is the one they use. And here it's interesting because you can see that, like in this mask, there's large, what look like hair combs, and it reflects the hairstyle of the time. And so again, I want to emphasize that the masks are not physical portraits, but only portraits of the soul, and that's how you should think of them. All right, so I'm going to stop here. We do have 2 more works of art to look at, so there will be a part 4. So stay tuned. We'll be looking at an actual processional for a royal visit, and we will be looking at some architecture as well for our final work of art. So stay tuned.